Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Tigers.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Fly Culture Podcast. Today I'm joined by Nick Measham, CEO of Wildfish. We're going to be talking fishing, conservation, and why you shouldn't be eating that shit that is farmed salmon. We're coming into that Christmas time now, and my hope, part of it out of this, is that it will motivate you to think about Christmas time. And if a family member says, what should we have? You're going to say, we shouldn't be eating salmon, smoked salmon, whatever it may be over that period. And if we can let more people know about it, that would be fantastic news. So we're going to talk fishing as well, but I'm going to probably, and I'm sure Nick is, I'm going to get on the soapbox a little bit because it's an emotive subject. And it's lovely to be able to do these podcasts and give you information about fishing, talk fishing with people. But also, to me, it's really important that we understand what is happening in our environment and how we can perhaps alert people in a wider spectrum about it as well. So we're going to kick off by welcoming Nick. Nick, it's great to have you back on the podcast. How are you doing?
Thank you. Well, very well, both personally and with Wildfish. Yeah, life is good. I mean, it could have rained a bit more over the summer, I guess, for most of us who are keen to get out there and fish. But hell, I mean, I'm pretty lucky because I've got access to a bit of chalk stream on the River Itchen, and the Itchen is relatively it's still over abstracted, but it's less over abstracted than some other rivers. And weed growth was good where I fish. Fly life was perfectly reasonable. So in that fishing that river, I had quite a good time. I'm afraid to say, turning to salmon fishing in a number of different parts of the UK, that was not the case. That was not the case at all. Fish were absent, so was water. With one exception, my daughter caught her first salmon on the Hallidale in the spring. She was the only one to catch. She caught it on her own. She caught it on a fly, and you've got one very, very proud father. And she said, I finally understand why you spent so much time doing what you were doing. I thought it was a complete waste of time until I caught this fish. So hopefully we've got one resolute convert to the cause.
That sounds fantastic. And that is a really proud moment. Did you net the fish for her?
I didn't. As it happened, I wasn't there. I'd gone off with Kate, my wife, her mother, to do something else. No, so it was netted by the fishery manager. We've got the photographs. So if I was more proficient at social media, I would have put them up there. But as I say, in the 3 days we were there fishing, she was the only one to catch a fish. Her boyfriend, he blanked. Her brother, my son, he blanked. And as I say, she didn't. And it was a beautiful, bright silver, 12-pound Springer. So what a fish.
So it's not all so bad, really, is it? Yeah, it's not so bad. And it's interesting you talk about the itching as well and the water levels and the weed and everything else. I know I was up back end on the test and it was okay. Some of the carriers there were very, very low. And it's nice to hear that the itching was okay. The lack of water, like you say, for the salmon was quite a big issue. And I found myself at the back end saying, actually, they've had such a hard time. I'm not going to try too hard. And I bumped into somebody who saw me trying to catch mullet instead of salmon and walked away almost shaking their head, I think. But it felt to me that I'll have a quick go, but it felt as though I should just let them go about their business. It's been a pretty tricky year for them. So I felt I'd leave them to it. Do you ever find yourself in that sort of situation? Do you feel that as well?
Well, increasingly, actually, funny enough, quite a lot of the time, because I suppose going with the job, you are aware of all of the challenges these fish face at all of the time. But I was debating this with myself and with others. back end fishing, should we sort of think about closing rivers earlier? For example, on the Tweed, the run is now front end loaded. It comes early in the season. They're not catching many fresh fish. But I mean, one interesting question would be that, okay, within that context, is it particularly harmful to fish and catch the occasional fish in the back end or not? And that would be an interesting question for people to look at. And these things are never entirely straightforward. But from my own feeling, I remember once with the late great Ori Vigfusson telling me that his attitude to salmon fishing was not so much, needing to catch lots of fish, but he just wanted to know that they were there. And that's sort of my kind of the approach that I've evolved to with fishing, is that I like to catch a fish. Everybody does, I think, who fishes. But my need to catch lots of fish or more fish than somebody else has evaporated. And that may be just because I'm getting older. But I think it's also an awareness of the conservation issues around these wonderful, wonderful beasts.
Yeah, it's a very difficult one, isn't it? And do you think that there are more people feeling the way that we are in your role? I guess you're going to have your finger or get a sense of that. But do you feel that there is a change in the, right, I'm fishing, and I get it, going to Scotland for a week back end is probably not cheap. And you want to get your money's worth. But do you sense that, people are saying, right, well, I've caught a fish today, that'll do it for today? Or is it still, is there a swing that you're seeing develop come through now in a more conservation-based manner with anglers?
I don't think again, it's just not straightforward. I think it's different people have different reactions, different boatmen do things slightly differently. I actually, let's put the cards on the table. I have a couple of days in early November on the Tweed at Lower North Walk. And this is an example of how rapidly things change. In 2012, we were catching, the majority of the fish we were catching were fresh. And now the run, that autumn run, doesn't exist. But the boatmen are friends. You feel a responsibility to them to some extent. So, yeah, we go and we fish and we don't catch very much. And maybe that's nature telling you. And sometimes the fish are more active than others, but I don't really understand salmon behaviour. There's lots of theories as to what makes them more or less aggressive. But you get the sense that now when we're there, the river is switching off, if not switched off, and that you might pick up an odd fish. So you're not actually, and there's a lot of fish in the beat. So you're, in that context, you're not doing a lot of, necessarily a lot of damage. But against that, you're helping keep people in livelihoods and the like. And it's a really difficult question, though. I mean, and my own attitude now is as far as salmon are concerned, I'm exclusively catch and release. I do my best not to even take them out of the water if I can avoid it. I use a pair of pliers or handheld forceps to just clamp on the hook and shake, and the fish comes off. So I think all of those things we have to do in order to mitigate what we're doing. And the reason I do the work that I then do is that within me, I would love to be in a position where salmon were in such an abundance we could take the occasional fish. That would be wonderful. Maybe not in my lifetime, but you never know. And we're going to keep working away to that end.
Brilliant. We'll come on to that as well. And I think that's a very, very key point that you make about people who are working in the industry and supporting them. And that is a very, very key point. But before we move on, tell me then, simple question, trout or salmon?
Help. Probably salmon. I spend most of my time trout fishing, but always been amazed by the salmon's life cycle from the very first moment that I really understood what fishing was about when I was about 9, and my parents bought me a very small solid fiberglass fishing rod, a sort of called a spinning rod. On a family caravanning holiday in Scotland, on this caravan site on the banks of the River Tummel. And where the caravan site was, of course, the fishing was hopeless. But I remember watching these salmon leap then and just wanting to understand about them. And that, funny enough, was the year of 1968 when UDN, I think, was harming the fish big time. And a number of the fish you could see in the fish ladder on the dam at Pitlochry on the Tummel has a glass window, and you could see fish sitting in it. And some of them were pristine, some of them had this fungus on them. But all of all, I just got fascinated, and I think the reason my parents bought me a fishing rod was because I was interested in fish before I was interested in fishing, because nobody in my family fished. And that's all I can think. I should have asked them. I'm sadly they're neither of them are alive now, so I can't. But it was a fascination, and the more I learnt about the salmon, the more unbelievable the life cycle of this fish actually was. And I think it's just one of those things I've grown to love. And I mean, I know it's kind of crazy. And I've had an uncle who said, what is the point of salmon fishing? Fishing for something that doesn't feed in fresh water, that, behaviour really, you're basically trying to provoke it to do something in all probability. It doesn't make sense versus, finding a feeding trout, casting an imitation of what it's eating and getting it to take it. Yeah, that I all love and that I all get 10 times over. But the salmon is just such a remarkable, almost mythical beast. We don't want it to become a mythical beast, but it is a remarkable creature. And so for those reasons, above all else, I think it's, I have to say, salmon.
Good choice. One thing you said fascinated me, and I'm in the similar sort of boat, that you said that you came from a family of non-anglers, and I'm exactly the same. I can't think of anyone other than Annette at Woodford getting sticklebacks and stuff out of a pond with my granddad when I was little. I didn't have anyone in the family that it's fascinating, isn't it? That something that you would expect you would have no natural affiliation with, that bites so deeply. It's an interesting one, and one I don't know I totally understand where and why that came from.
No, I don't. I've been trying to, maybe it's a part of the aging process, reflecting on how that all happened. And all I can think of is that I was and still am obsessed by nature, by fish behaviour, by running water. And I used to spend a lot of time playing in probably heavily polluted streams in the industrial West Midlands where I grew up, and down the canal and so on, sometimes with a net on a stick of bamboo, trying to catch sticklebacks and things like that. But it was, I had the Observer book of British fishes, I had the Observer book of sort of various insects and so on. And I guess for me, it comes from that absolute fascination. And I remember, trying to catch bullheads and stone loach in little streams with your hands, and incarcerating them in a jam jar and so on. That's where it all came from, because I can't think of not one of my aunts or uncles fished at all. I mean, even in the local ponds and things like that, let alone rivers. But it's extraordinary. They bought me this fishing rod in this caravanning holiday in Scotland, and I became besotted with it as an activity. And it has pretty much, with one period of time between the age of about 17 and, funny enough, when I got married, on that original holiday, if you can bear this story, I was, the next door caravan was somebody else who also came from Walsall, where we were living, by coincidence, and he was in his late 20s and had state-of-the-art fishing tackle. He had a hollow fiberglass fishing rod, one of those closed-face Abu fixed-spool reels. So he was my hero. And we were chatting away about fishing, and I said, I'm never going to give you this up. It's absolutely bloody brilliant. He said, well, funnily enough, when you get to about 16 or 17, you will lose interest in fishing. You'll become interested in girls and sport. And I thought I could see the sport, but having two younger sisters, I didn't, and being aged 9 at the time, I was struggling to see why anybody would think girls were in any shape or form an attractive commodity. Nonetheless, aged about 17, not 16, 17, yep, rugby and, in my case, largely failed attempts to get a girlfriend kicked in. And lo and behold, on our honeymoon, we went to the southwest of France and driving around in the Pyrenees. I found myself pulling over and getting out to look over the parapet of various river bridges. And my wife didn't understand what was happening because when I met her, I didn't fish. And so, and her mother invited me down with her to stay with an uncle of Kate's in Hampshire who had some fishing on the River Test, and I was allowed to go along and fish, and so the rest is history. I was back, and it was as serendipitous as that. And it's really thanks to my wife, although she would not be grateful, and always maintains that our marriage is based on a false prospectus. So, but there we are.
I think we can call that the reawakening, can't we?
We probably can call it the reawakening, and thankfully we are. On the other side of it, I've had some fantastic fishing, and on the other side of it, after 37 years, we are still happily married, whatever that means. But we
fantastic.
are
Many. I think that's congratulations are in order there. Yeah, so. What I'd like to do is move on because it's really important to me to understand and talk to you about the work that you're doing. And I'm very keen that listeners get a sense of what you're doing as well. I think, and particularly with your new campaign that we'll come on to a little later. But you are the CEO of Wildfish, which for listeners, if they I'm sure you're aware of Wildfish, but if you're not, it was formerly the Salmon and Trout Conservation. I know when we last spoke, you were sort of involved and you'd sort of told me that things may be happening and you may be moving on to another role within the organisation. I'm guessing this is probably what it turned out to be. But this rebranding, why did that happen? Was that something that you were keen to do in your role? And what does that actually mean, the wild fish? What are you trying to encompass within that?
Let's take this right the way back. I became CEO of what was then Salmon and Trout Conservation in, 1st of July 2020, so right in the middle of the first, I think, COVID lockdown, or in the middle of lockdown. I think it was the first one. I'm struggling to remember. And I had time to think about things. What the organisation does, the organisation is solely focused on the conservation of wild fish and their habitats. And essentially, through its history, that is salmon and trout. Salmon, sea trout, and trout, and the reason for that is that it's very simple. And this is it's a simplification and exaggeration, I know, but I think it basically holds water. And that is, if a river is fit for salmon in all of its dimensions, it is fit for almost anything. And, the river, and it also strays into our coastal waters as well, which ties in with our various campaigns on salmon farming. But that was the basic notion. And looking at the organisation and thinking, I want this organisation to live and prosper into the far future. How do we give it the vitality, the strength, the presence that it needs to have to really make the protection of wild fish an activity that really delivers for the fish, the environment, and for us. So, what have we got to do? What have we got to do? And I looked at the Charity Commission website, and I'm always fascinated by numbers. It's my sort of economic historian background, I suppose, that's sort of genetically now almost feels like it's genetically programmed into me. And I said, well, our income, I know, is at the time is about £700,000 a year. That's our income. What's the income of the, say, an organisation you admire that's protecting birds? So I looked at, with a wide mandate. So I looked at the RSPB. The RSPB's annual income is about 120 million. So you can do the mathematics. It is, nearly 200 times the size of about 200 times the size of our organisation, something like that. And that, I thought, well, we're never going to get to be that where we are. But ironically, the water habitats are more threatened in terms of the various pressures, the biodiversity decline. It's much more serious than that of terrestrials or birds. It is. They're all serious as well, but the water world is really under the cosh. So how can that be? It's a really serious problem, and yet, if you take those income numbers as numbers of kind of expressions of how people feel about these different things, we're nowhere. So we've got to change things. We've got to change things. In my view, we've got to have a much bigger voice for wildfish and their habitats to protect the beloved salmon that I've already confessed is my favourite fish. You've dragged it out of me. Well, we started where I guess everyone starts. We asked people. We asked our membership. We set up some focus groups of people of different age demographics and so on to see what was coming out of it. And what was coming out of it was that even amongst people who fished, that salmon and trout conservation sounds a bit old-fashioned. There's one hand, it sounds elitist. Was another comment that came up time and again, and somebody else said, it's you basically sound like a field sports organisation with all of those connotations. That's their words, not mine. And things like that kept coming back at us. So the question was, how do we think about that now? How do we begin to reposition ourselves so that we can appeal to as wide an audience as possible? Yes, fishermen are absolutely critical within that. I fish. I don't fish as much as I'd like to now because I'm doing this stuff, but I'm a fisherman. Lots of people who support us are fishermen. Fishing is an important aspect of my existence and many people's existence, and is a very important conduit for the protection of of wildfish and rivers. But we need to have a wider audience if we can. We need to make other people aware of the wonders that go on underneath our waterways, what fish do, and so on. And that's the aim of it. So basically, the aim was to get ourselves as big a voice as possible. And for the work that we're doing, the actual work we're doing, I mean, we've rebranded, we've changed the website a bit, but the underlying programs are all the same. I mean, there's the focus on the impact of aquaculture, salmon farming, the impact of pollution from agriculture and from sewage, the issue of abstraction, all of those issues which we're very much focused on. They haven't changed, but we are beginning to get people to contact us who've got nothing to do with fishing, are not part of our traditional stakeholder groups, but who are interested in finding out more about what the issues are with water and the water ecology and how they can help fix it. So that was the plan. The demographic of our existing membership also, I mean, looking at it from that perspective, is declining because of our average age of membership now is somewhere in the high 70s, and things happen as people get old. They either give up fishing or either permanently or whatever. So that's declining demographically. There's nothing we can do about that in that group. So we have to find a wider audience, and we'd also get feedback from grant giving trusts, which are now an important part of our funding makeup. That salmon and trout conservation, but can't fishermen afford to look after their environment themselves? Why should we be supporting you versus everything else we've got to support? So again, it was really moving the name to be more aligned with the work that the underlying work we're doing on the one hand, and widen that voice. So that's what we were trying to do. And the name Wildfish, sort of, I don't know really where it came. We were casting around for a new name for the Game Fisher magazine that we used to publish, and we have changed that slightly. So we now have an annual conference, or biennial it's working out at conference, which is entitled Owned by Everyone. And we were doing that in conjunction with the Cambridge Conservation Initiative and Pembroke College, Cambridge. And we did one on salmon. The next one coming up next end of March next year is going to be on chalk streams and all of the issues around chalk streams, which are really on the sort of environmental front line. And it's not just protecting it's protecting what is a very rare habitat, not a habitat that provides opportunities for fishermen on a very exclusive basis. That's not the point. And I'll come on to that later. But it was casting around, what can we call it? And I think we hit on the idea of, let's call it Wildfish. It's not in any way pejorative. It doesn't have any elitist. It doesn't have any of the connotations that salmon and trout was having for some people. So the academics at Cambridge loved it. The conservation people at Cambridge liked that. So I found myself Googling the website to see did wildfish.org exist as a URL, and amazingly it did. So we acquired it, and so far the rest is history. We landed a wonderful person, a number of your, I was going to say viewers, it's not, it's your listeners. The number of your listeners, it's a podcast, Nick. The number of the listeners will know Steve Edge, colourful character, runs a design agency, mad keen fisherman, turns out to be one of our trustees as well. So one way or another, we persuaded him to do the design work. So the design with the rebranding is down to him. So he should take all of the credit for that, and I'm there to take the blame. But that's sort of in a nutshell how it and why it's been done. And thus far, it seems to be gently working, making a bit of we're making progress. I'd like to be making more rapid progress, like any CEO, but in reality, I think it's working, and it's the first stage of, as I say, giving our fish the voice and I hope the protection that they absolutely merit.
That's great to hear, Nick, and congratulations on the name as well, because I think that's really contemporary. And like you say, the elitism that sometimes may be misdirected at our pastime is negated there. Listening to that, it's fascinating saying that you're, the average age of membership, which I guess is something that you'll be very keen to continue to get stuck into. And I know it's fascinating from our little world as well, that we find our readership tends to be a lower age group, and is probably somewhere that you may be looking to target a little bit more aggressively. And with the design, with the name and everything else, I think it's great to hear how proactive you're being with that, and how you're thinking about those age-old issues that our pastime has. I've said it many times before, and I'll continue to say it. J.R. Hartley did us a lot of harm, I think, in my opinion, that they think that fly anglers all look like that.
And I forgot to say, actually, that we did all of that too. The what you did with fly culture in terms of producing that, if you like, your brand of fly fishing communication and journalism, that was a big spur to us as well. That whole kind of stripping down to essentials and focus on what really matters in our sport was, and the design, the layout, the really contemporary feel. That was what, with our brand, I wanted. Funny enough, I told people I want a Wildfish NGO charity equivalent of that sort of that sort of style of presentation, feel, and so on. So you can take, Pete, with your you can take a bit of credit too.
Oh, well, that's deeply humbling to hear that. And, it is in our tiny little way, we've tried to get people to think about, as you've said, and many guests, it's not just the fish, it's everything about it, be that the environment, be that the company, be whatever it may be. It's a bigger encompassing pastime that I think we need to enjoy looking at, and that's what we've tried to do with that. So thank you so much for that. That means a hell of a lot to me. Let's move on a tiny bit. I saw a documentary. Somebody sent me this wonderful documentary from the 1950s recently, and I wonder if it was where this saying that fishing, and they say it in there, that it is the biggest participation sport in the country, which was fascinating seeing that. It's a wonderful. I may try and post it somewhere as well, because it was sent to me by a listener and a reader of the magazine. Thought I might quite enjoy it.
Yeah.
And even back then in the 50s, it was fascinating listening to somebody talk, or the presenter talk about the pace of life in the 1950s, but also they were talking about pollution then as well. And they used, I think it was the Tyne, it was the Weir or the Tyne, I think they used as an example of extreme pollution. And of course, how do things look to you now? And I know where we're going with this, and it's quite clear to the listeners as well, but where does this look to you now, and how would we be comparable to what they were talking about then in the 1950s? I'm guessing it's in a slightly different way. Rather than industry, it's corporations causing these issues, isn't it? Like water companies.
Yeah, I mean, the classical way of looking at it, and I think this is in large part valid, is that our industrial rivers have probably never been cleaner. I mean, you can go fishing in the middle of Bolton, or you can go, and catch some wonderful trout and grayling. The Wandle is probably the sort of the poster child of the urban river resurrection. A lot has happened there. There've been various directives, partly introduced under EU law, partly just evolution of English law and regulation, investment in sewage works, that have done a lot to clean up the urban environment. That is encouraging. There's not enough work being done on it, and as we've seen latterly, sewage overflows are a problem because the water companies haven't actually been making the investments that are required. The reasons for that happening are complicated, but that hasn't happened. We can and again, what has happened on the other side is that agriculture is basically industrialized, and it's now the case that the biggest single problem our rivers face, in my view, is in its various guises, is agricultural pollution. Whether it's the disposal of slurry from intensive dairy and beef units, or it's chemicals being sprayed willy-nilly on crops and used to treat those animals, aggressive ploughing, and so on, mobilising silt and sediment, the nutrients, phosphate, getting into our rivers, and so on. Those factors now, I think, are the dominant factors. And if you look at the various classifications that the Environment Agency is good enough to share with us about 5 years too late, but that's never mind. That's telling us that agriculture is the single biggest problem area as far as they're concerned, and in terms of the impact on the reasons for rivers not being at their good ecological status. So that's what's changed, and it's quite subtle. I mean, 50, 100 years ago, the Trent was grossly polluted, the Tyne was grossly polluted, Thames was grossly polluted for large sections. Those things have now changed pretty much, and those rivers are not grossly polluted. They do have life in them. The problem is they do not have as much life in them as they could have, or given the regulations under which the polluters are supposed to operate, should have. And that's the situation. So you could argue that some of our, the urban reaches of our rivers probably have never been or haven't been cleaner since the Industrial Revolution. But our rural rivers have never been in a worse state, or rivers in their rural, their sections outside towns have never been in a worse state. That would be, in many cases, I think that's a pretty fair statement. And it's interesting that throughout history, that we've always had these cups half empty type conversations with people. There were people worrying about the end of mayfly on the River Test at the turn of the last century. Wonderful author J. Waller Hills wrote about in the 1920s, worrying about what the future of fly fishing and, will the River Test be there in 100 years' time, and so on. And in the 1950s, fun enough, you allude to something. Someone just sent me a cutting from a letters page from Trout and Salmon magazine in 1959, where they were worrying about water abstraction and water pollution in the River Tweed. So it's ever thus. In a sense, it's great because it shows that people do care and have cared, even in times when we've thought that the world seemed like being a better place than it is today, about these issues, and these issues are around. The tragedy is now, with the technology we have available and the knowledge we have available, we have the ability to actually minimise the impact of these various things. At the moment, we're making a very bad job of doing so. And part of my job is to try and encourage governments and its agencies, Environment Agency and Ofwat, to get their finger out and actually make sure that the law that exists, and the irony is that we have had for many years sufficient regulation to do the job. We just simply haven't had any enforcement of that. And by enforcement, I don't just mean carting, polluting water company executives away and locking them up, though that's probably not a bad idea. What I am talking about is the whole process of doing the monitoring, which the agency needs to do, the inspections, the whole culture of a sort of environment culture, a culture of working to look after the environment and getting that into the consciousness of the farming community and of the water industry, that their job is not to minimise bills and to produce food at the least possible cost. It's actually to do that in a roundabout way so that those of us who are consumers also get to consume some environment alongside everything else, which at the moment we're being denied in the in the current sort of approach to looking after the environment and dealing with the pressures of economic growth and so on. Basically, I mean, it's just a fundamental problem. We don't cost the environmental inputs into economic growth, and if you actually did cost those in properly, you'd start to realise that that we might be better off in terms of the amount of money in our pocket. But actually, if you adjust that for and take away part of that money because of the damage done to the environment, then we're not going to be better off. And it's balancing those things up. And I think, a long-sighted view would be that we need to take the planet into account. The resources available to us are absolutely finite. And, we need to start paying serious attention to that. And within looking after rivers and water, you really are on the front line in that battle.
It seems mildly ironic to me that you have to remind or be on top of the EA with the issues that they have identified as farming, and they're not doing or it seems, listening to this and stuff that I hear, that they're not really doing a great deal about it. Do you see that changing? Because the way I look at it, we look at our micro little world, but things have changed a little bit recently in the last 2-3 years, where we've got wild swimmers, we got kayakers, we've got everything else. So the voice is a little bit louder, surfers, of course, as well, that the voice is a little bit louder. Does that mean that they have to pay that little bit more attention? I know the staff are disenfranchised at the EA. I know that they have staffing issues. If anyone can take redundancy, they will do right now. So I guess, and I know and understand that they're stretched. I often will give James Bevan's email address out publicly when people want it. So let me know if you do want that. And I have, and, people do contact him as well and get a reply. I'm sure it's not him, but it's one of his people. But do you think there is a change in that voice getting a little bit louder from what you've been doing since you've taken the helm, but also all these other entities as well joining together?
Yes, I mean, I think my answer to that is an emphatic yes. I mean, the various stakeholders and the organisations that you've listed: Surfers Against Sewage, Windrush Against Sewage Pollution, Ilkley, and so on. These organisations have actually added a new dimension to the debate, and they've done it, and because they focus on the people issues with pollution. They people using rivers for various things for recreational purposes, and that's brilliant. And we work very closely with them, and they are having a big impact. And what the trick is, though, is to make sure that the fish don't miss out on the back of all of these developments. And I mean, that couldn't be more sharply into account than the debate we've just been having about agricultural versus sewage pollution. Interestingly, with the work we've done to collect invertebrate samples, to using insects that live in the river to tell us about what's going on, because they're sort of absorbing what goes past them 24/7. We don't get strong signals for organic pollution in the places that we're sampling. And so what that means is that sewage isn't as big a problem as various forms of pesticides and other sort of chemicals than siltation and so on, and phosphates. So agriculture, on the evidence we collect, is having a bigger impact. But the amazing thing about the sewage argument is that has really lifted awareness of the whole problem and has changed the nature of the debate. And you do get a hearing. And I mean, we are heavily involved we're actually in the process of seeking a judicial review of the storm overflow discharge reduction plan that has been put forward by DEFRA. It's basically a load of rubbish, because, and to the extent that it's a plan, it's only and it's an addition to existing law. It's only dealing with basically a very small portion of storm overflows. The underlying issue behind this, which is the issue of concern for us and for others, is the underlying dumping of raw sewage in rivers, not because the storm overflows aren't working properly, because the water companies for one reason or another, haven't spent the money to put in place the infrastructure to treat basics, the basic load of sewage, because population has grown basically. So all of that is in existing law, and as far as we understand this plan, to the extent it is understandable, we think it's badly written and it doesn't make sense. It's actually effectively allowing, setting targets to be achieved by 2050 for things that are illegal today. So that doesn't strike us as a particularly compelling plan. So we thought we had to ask Her Majesty's government to rethink what they're doing on that one. But, all of that work is going on. That's because of this increased awareness of these problems. And it's all good grist to the mill. And talking to a number of those campaigners, they recognise that agriculture is a bigger threat to our sort of freshwater ecology from the point of view of the fish and the associated wildlife, but that it doesn't grab headlines in the same way that poo does. It's just not. So that's, again, another aspect of the work that we're doing is to try and to pull that together. But the fact is that people are now becoming aware that there is a problem is of itself hugely, hugely powerful. And it is beginning to get there. But, it's still the case, as you say, that the agricultural lobby don't want regulation, basically. But some basic form of regulation is necessary. I mean, I'm sure that most farmers are decent, law-abiding citizens who are aware of the regulations, the farming rules for water, and do their best to obey them. However, rivers being rivers, all it takes is one or two farmers somewhere on the catchment not to take it seriously, and that problem is spread throughout, and there are lots of them who do not, they are cutting corners. They don't, they haven't thought through what they need to invest in to dispose of their slurry or their digestate from anaerobic digesters. You had that incident in Devon on the River Mole where, it shouldn't have happened. It killed thousands of fish, and it was down to basically poor investment, I think, in kit that couldn't cope with the volume of digestate that was being rammed, that it was required to, and things like that. So yeah, I think it's changed. I think things are gradually changing. They need to change faster, but they are. There is an attitude and awareness now that you're not talking, it's not on deaf ears. I mean, 20 years ago, you could see there were problems when you went fishing, but the wider community had no interest. Now there is a big and growing, community of interest.
That's great to hear. And already I'm getting a sense of what you've done since you've taken on the leadership, which is wonderful to hear and inspiring. And we don't just stop there because, we've got the new campaign that I saw, I think it was last week, the week before, and I immediately had people on to me saying, you've got to speak to them, you've got to speak to them. And I said, don't worry, I'm going to speak to Nick and see if we can get him onto the podcast. And this is with Off the Menu. And can you tell, I know a little bit about it, but can you let our listeners know about what Off the Menu is and what you're aiming to do?
Okay, let's put it in context. Salmon farming, open net salmon farming. These salmon are farmed just off the west coast of Scotland. They're farmed throughout the entire North Atlantic seaboard, so basically across the entire natural range of the wild Atlantic salmon. And these fish farms are 99.9% open net, and you have a load of salmon put inside this net. They're fed, they grow, their crap sort of falls out onto the seabed. The fish themselves sometimes escape, and then they crossbreed with the wild fish. But they also are these nets. The fish are crammed in such density that they're reservoirs for sea lice, which then escape and latch onto the wild fish when they're making their first migration out past these nets from their rivers of birth out to their feeding grounds. They're young and vulnerable. A few sea lice get on them and literally can eat them to death. So they're causing a major stress to those migrating salmonids. They also produce lots of nasty exotic diseases, which also infect the wild fish. So because there's no barrier between the farm fish and the wild fish, the open net, there's a huge, very negative interaction with the wild environment. And that industry has grown like topsy. It's highly profitable. It's, managing these things in great density, and the fish grow relatively rapidly, and so on. But as I say, it has these other very, very malign environmental side effects. We have had a dialogue with the Scottish Government and with the fish farmers, or with the Scottish Government in particular, to say, look, you need to regulate this. It needs to be regulated to protect wild fish. Our concern, it's failing in that ground, it's failing on all other grounds too, and so we've demanded that they do to seek to do this. we set up a petition several years ago. The Scottish Parliament had 2 parliamentary inquiries which said the world has got to change. So we thought, fantastic, it's going to happen. Since that time, basically, the Scottish government has done approximately nothing of any real effect. It's come up with a list of proposals that basically don't protect the wild fish at all. The hurdles are not high enough, and so on. And so we have had that dialogue. That dialogue has led nowhere. So we felt we had to do something here. And it became actually clear to us that the one thing we could try and do is go route one, change hearts and minds to the extent we can do to get the consumer to boycott this produce and put pressure on. From our point of view, open net salmon farming should be shouldn't take place. So where can we apply maximum pressure? So the answer is by getting people to boycott this food stuff, and by making it very plain to as many people as you possibly can in order for them to change their attitudes to farm salmon, what's involved in the production of what might be on your plate. So we were casting around for the most effective ways to do this, and Andrew Graham Stewart, our director in Scotland, who's been championing Wildfish versus the fish farms for a very long time and has led on all of the dialogue work that's gone nowhere, notwithstanding all of the excellent stuff we tried to do, said, go for, and we're influencers. So we hit on the unoriginal idea of saying, well, let's ask chefs who are influential not to use farm salmon. And so that's the off the table campaign in essence, is to persuade chefs not to serve farm salmon. I mean, they are a small proportion of the total amount of salmon that is served, but their influence, through media is much greater than that. So we felt that's one way to go. So that's that campaign, and we've just launched it, and we've signed up some chefs already, and we viewed it as a campaign that will be just a rolling campaign, and it will grow. And so that's what that is all about. It is an awareness campaign. We would like to extend it, and as it grows, have conversations with supermarkets to make them aware of the problem. One of the issues there is quite interesting. Is that Marks and Spencer's boasts on its food packaging that it knows the provenance of every piece of beef or piece of vegetable that it serves. It also knows exactly where the farm salmon it serves comes from. But interestingly, they don't actually disclose that. And we think supermarkets should absolutely disclose where they're getting this muck from, because then you can tie it down. And we have got an app on the website that allows you to look at farms ranked by, you can look at the sea lice burden on the farm fish. One of the statistics, bizarrely, the fish farmers report, and it's self-administered, so I'm sure they'll find a way of avoiding it if it becomes something that people target. But you can actually see how farms are performing. If you could actually tie that in with the brand of salmon that you're buying, that becomes quite powerful, I think, for people to sort of realise that maybe the husbandry, the way the farm is run of the particular brand that they are buying is no good. They'll think about substituting it, and the honest answer is that all of these farms suffer to a greater or lesser extent from these difficulties, but it's just inherent in the production of farmed open net farm salmon. There is no way around it. And then in addition to that, we need to focus on sustainability in the food chain. Essentially, you'll feed it. It's like these are apex predators, so you're basically having to process a load of fish that you could actually eat, sardines and various other fish, in order to feed farm salmon. It's and it takes more than a kilo of those fish to produce a kilo of farm salmon. So it makes no sense in any sense at all. Not only that, those farm fish The fish food is being scooped up by factory ships, which is typically some of them around the west coast of Africa, some in the South Pacific. So indigenous populations are being literally starved. Their industry, their local fishing industries are being destroyed in order to produce this farm salmon. So you get the picture. So it really is a thoroughly unsustainable, from the point of view of its impact on wild fish and the environment, from the point of view of its impact on the food chain, and in addition to which, the animal husbandry is just awful. It is the case that, roughly speaking, the mortality of these fish before they actually get harvested, so before they enter the food chain, 25% of what you're growing typically dies. The mortality rates for battery chicken or for chicken are around about 3%. I think for cattle, it's about 5%. So within that context, again, you can just see that this thing is just not an acceptable way to produce protein.
Part of this, then, are you hoping to force the fish farms to look at other methods, i.e. closed containment systems for the fish, to look at their husbandry, as you say, or to force them into another species that can be farmed in that way that doesn't have that environmental impact? The reason I ask that as well is that I think about the Panorama program that was on, and the amount of people who contacted me afterwards saying there was more salmon on the shelves. And one of the problems with this, and this is why I'm hoping people who listen will, not just for Christmas, I've not eaten farm salmon for 7-8 years at least, because it became quite apparent what was happening there. But if people can let family members know, everything else, then if people are voting with their feet, then perhaps that starts to have an impact. But is that what you're hoping to do with this, is to get people to force these companies to make a change?
Yes, that's what we're hoping, really. One level it might sound naive, but yes, that is what we're hoping. And closed containment, well, it's a vexed one, because closed containment, by definition, puts a hard barrier between the environment and the wild fish and the farm fish. That's great. However, closed containment does have those issues of sustainability, which are around it, which, if you like, are not. That's not directly. I could say that's not my concern. My concern are the wild fish and their habitats. So that solves that box. Ticks that solves that problem. So in a sense, that's great. Let's make that move. I suspect that in terms of the way that the wider public look at these things, that concerns over sustainability are going to weigh heavily on their minds. And I can see a situation where the answer is intensive production of farm salmon, whether it's open net or closed containment, is problematic. Open net, absolute no. Close containment raises issues, but that and that we should be looking at substituting other fish, that are in sustainable quantities. And I'm told at the moment, Cornish pollock. We're not going to recommend any of those because it's just beyond our. We don't know. We don't know enough ourselves to be able to do that. But mackerel, Cornish pollock, and whiting are all things that you can substitute. Because basically, if you think about it, there's got to be something inherently nuts about farming apex predators. It's rather like farming lions or tigers, and why we don't need to do that, because we're perfectly happy to eat lion fodder, which are called cattle or whatever, or deer, rather than the higher up the food chain predators. So I think we have to rethink all of those things probably. But from our point of view, from the point of view of the wild fish, we just want a massive reduction in open net salmon farming, and an end to any. We want to see not only any expansion knocked on the head. We'd like to see a managed managed reduction of capacity.
That would be great to hear. And, we've talked over an hour now, Nick, and we've covered lots of ground. And interestingly, one of my last questions were if listeners aren't members of Wildfish, why should they be? But I don't need to ask that question because it's become very clear to me during this conversation why they should. It's become very clear to me that somebody's fighting our corner, and not just because I think petitions are wonderful things, but you've just got to be in people's faces continually, I think, to affect change. So my hope with this is that people have listened to this and they thought, actually, this is a guy, I love what he's doing along with his team, and they're fighting for our fisheries and actively doing that, and not just sort of rolling with the punches. They're actually getting straight back up and they're back in their faces again. I think, to me, this is what we've needed. And I'm thrilled to listen to you speak eloquently and passionately about these things. And I know we've only scraped the surface of things, but it's just to give people an indication of what you're doing and why we shouldn't. So, in summary, again, we're coming to that time of year where salmon is on the menu or is talked about. If you can find off the menu pictures anywhere, put them on your social media. Tell your family members about it. If it's on your Facebook group or Facebook, and you've got family on there, let them see these things. Let people understand why they shouldn't eat this shit, because we shouldn't be eating it. We should not be supporting companies who are polluting our waterways in this way. So we need to do something about it. And I'm really thrilled to hear Nick talk about this and trying to do something about it. I think we owe it as anglers, but also as people who care about our waterways, that we get behind these things and do what we can to push it. I've never asked for anything out of these podcasts, but one thing I will ask is if you can spread the word about this shit, please do it. And that's all I'll ever ask of you. But Nick, is there anything, if people want to find a little bit more out about Wildfish, how can they find the shiny new, spanking new website, social media handles, and everything else?
Right. Well, www.wildfish.org will take you into our world, and that's probably the simplest way to get in. You can Google Off the Table. We've got a microsite for that, which has, again, all of the ways into all of the social media handles. Or if none of that's working for you and you're about as digitally competent as I am, you can get hold of me at Nick, N-I-C-K, at wildfish.org. Nick, N-I-C-K, at wildfish.org, and I will I'll put you straight. And do join us, as Pete says. I'm not going to offer you anything other than my team's wholehearted commitment to cleaning up, protecting wildfish and cleaning up our waters and protecting wildfish and their habitats. So you're not going to get burdened with, we can send you a nifty car sticker, and you might be able to buy at some ridiculously cheap price some of our branded merchandise. But apart from that, you get nothing other than our undying commitment to protecting wildfish and their habitats. So, and thanks, Pete, for giving me the opportunity to bang on about something that I care about so much.
That's been brilliant, Nick. Thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. And I know we talked for quite some time beforehand, and I'm sure we're going to talk some more afterwards as well. There's some things I'd like to do to try and help as well. But thank you for taking the time to talk with me today.
It's been a pleasure.
Everyone, this has been the Fly Culture podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of it. And, I've tried to, Nick has very eloquently tried to tell us a little bit about what's going on there and people who are fighting our corners. So I hope you've enjoyed this one as much as me. And there'll be another one very, very soon. Thanks so much for listening.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter.